evening. Welcome. Oh my goodness, look at all of you. There's so many of you. All right, let's give a round of applause to just this many people being in this room. I'm really happy about this. Okay, wonderful. Well, I'm Hannah. I'm the program coordinator for Humanities Washington. If you have not heard of Humanities Washington before, we are who sponsor the Think and Drink events at Naked City. These events also happen in a bunch of other cities across Washington state. They happen in Spokane, Yakima, Tacoma, Bellingham, and several others. Humanities Washington is a statewide nonprofit. We are dedicated to bringing quality humanities programming to Washington state residents. So we have all sorts of programming. You can see on the back of your program some upcoming events that we have in Seattle. It's just a little taste of the kind of work that we do. I want to thank you all so much for coming to this event. This is part of the Think and Drink series since '68. We're going to be investigating different ways that the world has changed or not since 1968, 50 years ago, a very tumultuous time, and we are once again living in a very interesting time, and we want to take a historic look at what's changed and what hasn't. So I want to thank all of our amazing panelists and moderators. I'm going to let them introduce themselves because they can speak for themselves so much better than I can. And you have in your program, you have an audience evaluation. I would love it so much if you would fill this out after the event. I will have pens for you, I will have smiles for you, and I would really, really appreciate that. So thanks again, thanks so much for coming. Thank you to Naked City for this beautiful space and for their beautiful food. I really encourage you to eat some fries. The fries are my favorite. Okay, all right, I'm gonna turn it over to Teresa and she's gonna kick us off. Thanks again.
Well, thank you, Hannah, and thanks again to all of you for being here today. My name is Teresa Chabatari, and I'm a sociologist at Pacific Lutheran University down in Tacoma, and I'm also a member of the Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau. So I will invite our panelists to introduce themselves.
My name is Charmaine Sly. I am an activist. My most recent activity was speaking in front of 175,000 of you. I was the MC at the Women's March in 2017.
I got my own. Hi, I'm Amy Peloff. I am a feminist historian and media studies scholar, affiliate faculty in gender, women, and sexuality studies at UW, and also a member of the Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau.
Thank you.
Oh, and I feel like I should also say former assistant director of the Comparative History of Ideas program, because they are well represented.
You got your people here. That's great. That's great. All right, so as Hannah said, this Think and Drink series is really sort of looking back to 1968 and thinking about sort of where we have come in the last 50 years and what more we have to do. So I'd like to start by really just bringing us back to September of 1968. So it was a year after the Summer of Love and a year before Woodstock. The Vietnam War and the anti-war movement were reaching their peak. The Black Panther Party was organizing in communities across the country. 1968 saw the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. On April 4th. So tomorrow is the anniversary of his assassination, or his murder. Robert Kennedy was also assassinated in 1968. And 1968 also saw the passage of the Civil Rights Act. It was a time of unrest, of challenges to authority, and of fighting for equity and change. So in September of 1968, the Miss America pageant was happening in Atlantic City. And there was a couple of hundred of protesters, feminist activists, who were protesting outside of the pageant. And they had a multi-issue platform that they were protesting, but it's the place where the protest is best remembered of the beginning of the feminist bra-burning myth. So I want to start by asking Amy. Excuse me, hello.
Sorry, we're just talking amongst ourselves.
That's right. So I want to start by asking Amy, if you could give us a little bit of context about that protest, sort of what was going on, and kind of where this bra-burning feminist myth originated.
Okay, so this is the most lectury that we're going to get for this evening, so just bear with me. So when we talk about the history of feminism in the United States, we generally talk about it in terms of waves. So the first wave of feminism happened in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and that was the fight for women's suffrage. The second wave of feminism is what we're talking about in this Think and Drink, and that is the fight for more of a societal change in terms of rethinking what women's roles meant in society as well as men's roles. And then third wave feminism generally is considered to have happened in the 1990s with the whole girl power thing, and then it's all up for grabs as to whether or not there have been any other waves beyond that. Now, what I want to say in terms of waves is that it's really important to think about this literally in terms of the water, right? So that the water is always there. The feminist activism and organizing is always happening. It's just sometimes you can see it a little bit better than others, and that's when you see the waves. And frequently that waves isn't necessarily more about increased participation, but it's more about increased media awareness of what's going on. So the second wave of feminism is generally considered to have kicked off in 1962 with the publication of 1963, excuse me, with the publication of The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. And that book was really focused on talking to college-educated white housewives living in suburbia who were feeling incredibly dissatisfied with their lives. And Betty Friedan's basic advice was, get a job. And so maybe not even paid job, but at least you have to start working outside the home. And so that kicked off this movement. She ended up joining forces with the women who had been activists within the suffrage movement and the organizations that they formed in the wake of that. And those were organizations that were really focused on changing legislation to try and get women better divorce laws, financial independence, and better workplace protections. And in 1968, you really see the kickoff of a different section of the second wave of feminism, which is the women's liberation movement, which was focused less on legal action and more on social interventions. And so these are the women who were really trying to focus on getting us as a society to rethink what women's place in society was. And so the Miss America pageant actually ended up being a really great space for a lot of those issues to be addressed. So it was looking at this place where women were basically just being paraded and judged based on their looks and their fashion sense, and really for being put out there for the male gaze. One of the things that the protesters were upset about was the connection between the military and the Miss America pageant. Miss America pageant contestants were actually sent overseas to entertain troops. And also they were disturbed by the lack of racial diversity in the pageant. Up until 1950, women of color were not allowed to participate. And even through 1968, there weren't, I can't even remember what year it was that the first African American woman participated. There had been Asian American and Puerto Rican women participating in the pageant before 1968. But in 1968, that was really something that people were wanting to draw attention to. And interestingly enough, there was also this parallel protest happening in the form of the Miss Black America pageant that was put together by a Philadelphia entrepreneur who was upset because his daughters actually aspired to be Miss America, and he recognized that they wouldn't have that ability. So he organized the Miss Black America pageant that actually started after the end of the Miss America pageant so that they would not have to compete for audiences and still get the word out of what it was that they were doing. Okay, so that is the end of lecture for tonight, and from here on out, it's just going to be pontificating.
So what about the bra burning?
Oh, yeah, the bra burning. Okay, so there's a lot of kind of interesting history around that. So the idea initially was that there was this Freedom trash can that they wanted to light on fire, but they couldn't get the permits for it because the boardwalk in Atlantic City was a little sketchy. So they ended up just throwing bras and cosmopolitan magazines and girdles and false eyelashes into this trash can, but never actually set it on fire. And a reporter who was there just decided to add a little more spice to the story, and he made that part up, which then became one of the most enduring images of second wave feminism and one of the the legacies that women continue to have to fight against when people think about what feminism is. It is a bra burner.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Charmaine, you have memories of 1968. So, can you please share a little bit about your reaction to the Miss America protest, to the Miss Black America pageant, and the assassination of Martin Luther King that also happened in that year?
So, who out there, raise your hand if you were at least a teenager in 1968? The rest of you are like, wow, they are old. Yeah, yeah. So I was 15 years old. I was living in, yes, I'm 65 this month, April 28th. So, feel free to send presents, I'm good. But in 1968, I lived in Seattle in Madrona, which was predominantly black then. It's not that now. And we didn't really pay much attention to Miss Black America. Like, what? Like we never even watched Miss White America. We didn't care. I was busy sitting at the Black Panther office trying to figure out how we could have breakfast, school breakfasts. That's what we were doing. So that was our big plan. We'd have breakfasts for kids that didn't get any breakfast, and that's what we were doing. And, you know, I was in love with Bobby Seale, and I liked, you know, Huey Newton. I like all these people. I was reading all this other stuff, so I wasn't really paying attention to that. But when Martin Luther King was murdered, I don't say assassinated, because assassinated sounds like it's a party, like, oh, just assassinated. No, he was murdered. So when he was murdered, I thought the world was coming to an end. Like, what's going on? This person that I admired, I didn't always agree with every single thing he said, but here he was murdered. So now what? And then to find out that the Miss America, the Black Miss America contest was going on, they put their program at at midnight, so they thought that maybe they could still get publicity or get the reporters over from the Miss America. They'd come if they had it at midnight. And so Miss Black America was not crowned until 3 o'clock in the morning. And still they really didn't come. So that was not a time in which I felt personally like my world was on fire. I mean, they had the black glove in Mexico City. Okay, the people who raised their hands before, do you remember this? Then they did the fist. So I was going to Garfield High School, and we decided as cheerleaders that we should all wear a black glove. So we did this whole black glove thing, and we were playing Ballard High School, and the cheerleaders all came running over and said, "We want black gloves." It's like, no, I think you're missing the point. You're missing this. But they told us we couldn't do it. They said, okay, we don't want you. Our counselor came and said, this is not right. You know, if you want to protest, you got to go do that someplace else. This is a football field. You're cheerleaders. You're supposed to be encouraging people. Then we made up our own cheers. Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. Yeah. So we couldn't, so when we talk about feminism and this idea, to me, that's not something I resonated with at all. I resonated with the fact that when I walk in the door, you did not notice that I was a woman. The first thing you notice is that I was black. And I had this big afro that I loved and took very good care of.
Thank you, Charmaine. So you said that, you were really focused primarily on racial equity and racial activism. And you said that feminism at the time didn't really resonate for you. So at this point now, 50 years later, what does feminism mean for you?
I can't say to you honestly that that I have a huge resonance to it even now, because I'm still that same person. When I walk in the door, when I don't get a job, I don't think it's because if I don't get a raise, I don't think it's because I'm a woman. I think it's because I'm black. And that piece, when we talked about the Women's March, and the Women's March 2017, 2016, we still continue to organize them, and now we're Seattle Women Marching Forward. So I honestly can say to you, I probably have learned more about feminism from these young women that I work with. When we talked about the Women's March, I was just like, I want to do this because this isn't right that this guy's doing this. That this man has all of a sudden become what we should all be watching and doing what he says in his administration. So I didn't really recognize that until I talked to my daughter, who said, Mom, you are such a feminist, it's tiresome. Like, you're such a feminist. Like, you have, you know, she goes, how can you say you're a lesbian and not be a feminist? And then it made me do some research. Like, okay, so who knew that in the National Organization of Women, that's who put together that 1968, how many people, give me, what a percentage do you think of the women organizing that were black? Just yell out one. No, actually, Florence Kennedy. Remember her name?
Yeah, good. I got
Florence Kennedy. She's a black activist at the time, and she straddled both cultures. She was involved with the black movement, and she also was involved in NOW. But then there were also a lot of lesbians that were involved with NOW, because at that time, when they said bra burning, people blamed it on the lesbians. Ugh, those lesbians, they don't want to wear bras. That's them that's doing that. And it wasn't. And Florence was really constantly pushing forward to say, what about black women? Because every time we talk about feminism, it's usually a white face. It's a white woman. I'm mad. I'm angry that this is going on. You know, whereas we, every single day, we have to deal. So.
Yeah. Thank you. What about for you, Amy? What does feminism mean to you?
Well, gosh, sorry. I just have this thought in my head from when Charmaine was speaking about the history of the National Organization for Women, which, you know, always had women who were trying to push for a more intersectional understanding of what feminism needed to mean. And in addition to the women of color, there was also what was then known as the Lavender Menace, which was actually a phrase that Betty Friedan used, which was the queer women who were trying to force the National Organization for Women to kind of rethink how it is that they were defining femininity, and she was trying to push them out of the organization, and eventually at some point they showed up in these lavender t-shirts that said Lavender Menace, and made a big stink about it. But anyway, that's just a little historical aside. For me, feminism has 5 fundamental ideas. The first is that there's no clear determination as to whether or not gender is determined by biology or by socialization. And there are feminists who will argue strongly for either side or for neither or for a different idea. The second thing is that the idea of woman is almost meaningless, right? Because once you add that intersectional lens, it's kind of always this moving target. And if you're ever able to talk about the concept of woman without clarifying it in relation to other identity categories, it's because it's aligning with the dominant identities. So you see this a lot with like sitcoms, right? There's sitcoms and then there's race-based sitcoms. Well, you know, something like Friends is actually a really race-based sitcom. It's just white, and we don't necessarily identify it as race-based. Whereas something like Blackish, we're like, oh yeah, no, that's for black people. The third thing is that, gosh, I have 5 of these that I talk about all the time. Let me think. That women get to choose what they do with their bodies, and that this relates to health. This relates to the freedom to walk down the street, so freedom from sexual violence, and that this is something that society is continuously trying to control. I literally cannot remember what my 5 points are without my PowerPoint presentation. But anyway, we'll just leave it at that.
Yeah,
and if
that
I come up
works.
with any more smart ones, I will get back to you.
I think that that's the part that I can relate to about feminism. Is that it's really, to me, no matter what shade you are, it's about being able to control your reproduction. That I'm in charge of that and nobody else is. That piece I definitely feel strongly about.
Well, and it's interesting as somebody who has 0 interest in reproducing, and clearly at this point in my life, it's not going to happen. Like, what does that do with my identity as a woman? right? Do I even count as a woman anymore if I'm like not ever going to use these parts? You know, and does it ever matter? Like, do you need to know what parts I have unless you're actually interested in reproducing with me? And so at what point do we actually need to identify somebody as male or female? But that's kind of more of an intellectual experiment, because it doesn't matter, because when push comes to shove, when I walk into a room, somebody is trying desperately hard to identify me. And you know what happens when you kind of get confused and you're like, oh, what is that? And then you start looking, you're like, okay, what kind of shoes are they wearing? How big are their boobs? Is that just because of weight? You know, like all of a sudden your brain is doing all these mental gymnastics so that you can categorize it, because for whatever reason, society has trained us to be very committed to these categories that actually have no meaning and end up doing an enormous amount of harm in how it is that we go through our lives on a day-to-day basis.
But it also, that glass ceiling, I think, happened too, because, oh, we don't know if we want her to be management, because really if she's on her period, or wait, she's having a baby, well, yeah, we're going to get rid of her, because she's having a baby, she'll never come back and do the job the way she should. She's too emotional. I mean, I think those kinds of things really set us into this pattern that it feels like so many times it's impossible to break. Raise your hand if you believe that. Yeah, these are people that probably didn't get, they immediately start thinking that. And when I feel like there's a younger generation that thinks, no, I can get any job I want. But still in the back room, there's still the back room.
So let's shift a little bit to talking about some connections between the activism of 1968 and to today. And in particular, I want to talk about the Me Too movement. And sexual harassment is something that's been going on forever. And I just wonder if you guys have some thoughts about why the Me Too movement has really taken off now. Like, why is this happening now?
I mean, for me, I think the Me Too movement has everything to do with Donald Trump being elected president. Because up until this point, we've been incredibly willing to put up with this. I was listening to a story at NPR, and they were talking about how Bill Cosby's trial that's about to start is going to be different from the one that he had right before the Me Too movement started, and how what the conditions, the story of what happened hasn't changed at all, but the environment in which that story is going to be told is dramatically different. And so it'd be really interesting to see if the outcome shifts, because our minds have changed a little bit. I think it's amazing, because we've seen these moments, what we thought were watershed, that were like, okay, this is the time when we won't be going back. This is the time where it's going to change for women in the workplace, for women to be able to walk down the streets, whether it was in like 1984 when the first sexual harassment in the workplace cases were being argued, and that the concept of quid pro quo harassment and hostile work environment was first being developed. And so that seemed like an exciting moment, and then we pulled back from it. And then, the Anita Hill hearings made, okay, we're never going to go back from that. And then we managed to go back from that. And then all of us, and even like Bill Cosby, everybody's like, oh my God, And it kind of blows my mind, because I would have thought that would have done it more than Harvey Weinstein, just because of our society's willingness to believe bad things about black men versus white men. But for whatever reason, I think it was that because Harvey Weinstein happened after Donald Trump, and that the things that Trump said were so horrific, and you had politicians from all parts of the political spectrum saying, this is absolutely unacceptable. As somebody with wives and daughters, I can't, this is totally not acceptable. And then all of a sudden it was like, well, okay, no, it's fine, actually.
Is it also because of who his victims were, right? They were famous white women who, like, we all knew, versus sort of anonymous, unknown victims?
I don't know, though, because people had known that this had happened. It was an open secret that Harvey Weinstein had done this, and actresses were warning each other, but also in the gossip columns, this stuff was coming out again and again and again, and for whatever reason, people didn't care until all of a sudden they did.
I think that the whole casting couch, the whole idea of the casting couch, that's what's going to happen. And with Anita Hill, there were so many people who were complicit in that, like Joe Biden. He was in on that too. Nobody believed her. Was it because she was a woman or because she was a black woman? That it never seems to. It's never going to go away, and it really is to me so. It really means so much to be able to speak to someone about it. That women, that whole tape over your mouth, that silence, like no one's ever going to believe me. The upside of this, I think, is more people are going to be believed. But we, as women, I feel, so much have to speak up without thinking, if you're going to lose your job, you're going to lose your job. Okay, but you need to say something because you know that this person is going to do it to the next, to the next, to the next. And I was thinking about Bill Cosby. I thought, I can't even think, if I was an attorney on that, is he going to get anyone on the jury that has not heard about this? I mean, I don't really care, but it feels like wow, what would it be like to be on that jury? Like that's incredible. And how will they run it differently from then to now? I think it's a really great question.
So thinking about the connections between 1968 and today, and the activism in these two eras. Roxane Gay has written about how there are these connective tissues between women's activism in '68 and today. So what are some of those connective tissues that you see, and what are some of the lessons that feminist activists have learned in the last 50 years, or the mistakes that were made 50 years ago that we're trying to do better with now?
Okay, I have 3 lessons, and you guys have to remind me that I have 3. I'm going to say them all real fast. The first is intersectionality. The second is domestic labor. And the third is, I don't even know how to say this, but it's this kind of competitive nature of activism that I think is something that I'm seeing happen a lot. Okay, so those were the 3 that I wanted to get on the ground. The first one, which I've already forgotten, which was intersectionality, right? That was something that was huge in second wave feminism, but that has been erased in feminist history, which I think is super fascinating. And my theory is that a lot...
So what is intersectionality?
Yeah, that's
intersectionality was what I was talking about earlier, which is that the concept of woman is kind of meaningless, because it's just one of many identities that make up who we are. So I like to think about it in terms, our identities are all just this web, and so we're made up of gender and race and class and sexuality and religion and age and ability and a bunch of things that don't even matter until all of a sudden they do matter. I don't know. So to go back to the sitcom example, right? Like you've got Blackish, you've got Friends. I don't know if anybody is watching Grace and Frankie right now, which is, your typical white upper class sitcom, except that it's actually about older people, which is something that has never actually been taken seriously on a sitcom before. So it's interesting to see what identities start to pop up, and that's how you know that there's this explicit intersectional analysis. And when they're invisible, then you know that that's just something that's aligning with the dominant identities. So with Grace and Frankie, when I watch it, I don't necessarily notice that they're white. I don't necessarily...
I do.
Which makes a lot of sense.
And they're the pretend gay. It's like there's no one who's gay on the show. Anyone?
Yeah.
No.
Well,
Wait. Is there
Lily
someone
Tomlin.
gay? Yeah.
So anyway, so that's what intersectionality is. And so like we were talking about before, that in all of second wave feminism, there are always women of color having to be like, okay, no, wait a minute. You know what? This whole idea of domestic labor is super great that you white women are thinking about working now, but we've always had to work, you know? And mostly we've been doing your housework so that now you can go out and have a really awesome job. There was the whole Lavender Menace thing, right, where queer women were saying, you know, this whole, I mean, to go back to the whole domestic labor thing and childcare and stuff like that, they're like, yeah, it's not really my issue, but you know what is this idea of what it means to be a lesbian and how that gets fetishized in male heterosexual fantasies, you know, things like that. And the history of second wave feminism ended up getting written by a really small group of white women activists who all went to grad school and wrote their dissertations on their experiences. And so their stories got codified as history and everything else got erased. And so you have these third wave feminists coming along and being like, dude, have you heard about race? Have you heard about intersectionality? This is a thing that we need to start thinking about. And there's a lot of people who are like, okay, that's actually been a thing we've been thinking about for a long time. And that's why, you know, a lot of women feel erased and excluded from the concept of feminism because for whatever reason, their participation, their contributions to the theory just keep getting erased over and over time. Okay, I talked about a long time for a long time. Why don't you take
the
it?
question. Say the question again.
Parallels between 1968 feminism and today.
The connective tissues and what are the lessons
I
we've
think
learned.
that using the word intersectionality, and it just seems like in the activism work that I do, it's constantly said, and thank you for making sure someone defines it. Because I think that feminism can get so academic, like you said, it's just so academic. And next thing you know, we're trying to figure out how come there's not more women of color talking about it? Well, because you're not really talking to us. You're not really trying to make sure. There was this, when we were planning the march, there's 21 women that originally planned the original march here in Seattle, 21. And people always say, oh, if we could just work with women, it'd be so much easier. That's not true. We had this when we opened our meetings, we always, of course, thanked the people we were standing on their land. And then you had to say whether you had to identify as a she, her, them, they. And that was new to me. I was like, oh, okay. All right. But by the time we got around with 21 women, that was 20 minutes of the meeting already taken up. Not going to diss that happened, but it was like, okay. So I started thinking to myself, so is this getting a little academic here? No? Okay. So, but my point being that every time we all come together, we're trying to find ways in which to communicate and dialogue instead of simply talking. Like how many ways? How many ways do we have to try to figure this out? And so someone said we should do this thing where what's it called? Danny, will you help me? Progressive stacking. Who knows progressive stacking? Oh, thank God nobody else knows it. Okay. I'm telling you, you do this thing where the youngest person of color in the room gets to speak first. Now, that sounds really great, but I know as a black woman, I sometimes need time to take what you're saying into my brain, to translate it into something I understand, translate it back out to speak to you. That's just the way it is. I'm constantly having to do that. So not necessarily am I going to answer something right away. I need to kind of think about it like, I got to translate this in, mulch it around, and put it back out again. But this poor youngest woman of color was constantly getting called on first. And she was getting pretty cranky about it because she wasn't ready to speak. And she felt like everything was on her. So when I started talking to other people outside of these 21 women, like, well, what's this progressive stacking? And finally someone says, you know that was made up by a white woman. Because she wanted to pretend like she was giving deference to you. And so when I think about how have things changed, things have changed into a false deference to me. because you really didn't want to hear what I had to say. And then when you did, you said, she's kind of mad. She's kind of cranky about it. I said, no, I'm talking to you just like I talk to my niece, But if you translate it as being something mean, then you need to check yourself, because I'm just saying how I feel. So I think that's, to me, that changed.
Yeah. So I think that's a great example of sort of white women having sort of good intentions, right, about creating this formal sort of discussion structure to make sure that everyone has a voice, but in the process, it ends up silencing or sort of forcing to speak before people are ready to speak, right? So there's this distinction then between sort of the intent, but it's still not really sort of breaking down those barriers. It's still very structured and yeah.
Exactly, it's so structured, but we finally figured out that we really did well in smaller teams. So then I went back and looked at the manifesto that they wrote in 1968 for their protests. They had 10 points, and every single one of those points were things that we had on ours, that the National March people had come up with. And I thought, wait a minute, I think they took this and just moved around some of the words. But what I loved is, like they said, like when you're talking about burning bras and that there was this permit business. Well, bottom line is, they said in their manifesto, we don't want any male cops. And they said cops. We don't want any male fire people. Well, at that time, there were very few women. I don't know if there were any women that were firefighters. And then they'd say at the end of each sentence, they say a couple of times, can you dig it? And I thought, now that had to be Florence. That had to be her voice to say that, like, can you dig this? Like, this is what we don't want. And they didn't want any male reporters. They said, we will not talk to male reporters. Whereas we said, we don't want the police to come in riot gear, because Seattle police are well known for coming in riot gear, whether they need it or not. But they didn't, because we requested, please don't do that. So that change, that change is not that big. It's really not.
Yeah.
So is an inclusive feminism even possible? Is it possible to have solidarity among women across these other differences?
That is the $10 million question, right? I mean, I think yes, because that's the way the world is, right? That's the reality that we live in. I mean, and I think we just haven't figured out how to imagine a way in which that actually is operational. And so what we have now are these efforts like the stacking blah, 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 that, ends up being really performative. It's like, let me perform how woke I am or whatever, like I am going to make sure everybody knows my pronouns. I'm going to make sure everybody knows that I'm aware that I'm on indigenous lands. I'm going to make sure that everybody knows that I know that I need to keep quiet and listen. But do I know those things? Have I internalized those things? Or am I just performing that and using it as a bludgeon on people who aren't performing this in the way that I think that they should, rather than actually trying to figure out how to do honest dialogue across difference so that we can figure out how to advocate for each other and for the world that we actually want to create and live in.
I agree, and I feel like when you bring yourself to a room, it's much easier. For me, if I just bring myself in the room, I don't have to be somebody else. And if what I am saying is not working for you, then you need to speak up. I will. What I think the big lesson we got out of organizing this massive thing is we honestly didn't have time to quibble. We had 6 weeks, and it had to happen in 6 weeks, and we didn't have time to quibble. But we also really agreed on the big pieces. You know how they say, don't mind the small things? Don't mind. We had to mind the details, because otherwise you wouldn't have had bathrooms and all those things. But in our whole feeling about why we were doing it, we never disagreed on that. And we were just going to move forward. And I thought, this has really been a lesson, because out of that came 9 women that was our whole, no one else in the nation was saying, we're doing this because we want you to pay attention and build firewalls around nonprofits that are going to die from this administration if you don't mind them. And we've lost some already because they weren't minded. Everybody felt like they needed to march and then go home. Some people did, let me put it that way. But that we learned how to kind of come together. And it's made these friendships, even though politically we are across the board. But we still are united in wanting to protect that. And it's been very challenging and very making me open my life to realize, okay, as much as I need you to hear me, I also need to listen. But listen in a way that we're going to both walk away enhanced. That's what true dialogue is. We both walk away learning something new, like, oh, aha.
So it sounds like finding common ground
Yeah,
then becomes
I
a
think
way
so.
to negotiate difference.
Well, and I think
Yeah.
it reminds me of this thing that I learned in graduate school a long time ago. Because, you know, a lot of graduate school is very performative, right? Like, let me just show you how much smarter I am than you, but definitely how much smarter I am than the stuff that we're reading. You know, so like you're reading stuff and your entire goal is to figure out how to rip this person's argument apart. And somebody told me once, like, that when you first read something, you need to do a generous read. So you're not reading it for flaws, for argument, but you're reading it for what the point is, what this person is trying to contribute. And I think that that's a lesson that we need to bring to our activism, right? Like we're all here because we want to improve the world. And my trying to figure out how to pick apart what your argument is rather than trying to figure out what it is that you're offering and contributing, and vice versa, right? I mean, is just, it would be so much more powerful if we did a generous listening of each other rather than a competitive listening.
So what does inclusive feminism look like to you all?
And now y'all sitting up there looking at us like, aren't you guys the ones talking?
We're tired. It's
We're
your
tired
turn.
now.
Yes, please.
Can you stand up and say it because I can't really hear you?
Well, I'd say for me, it's been the ability to really allow myself to be uncomfortable and listen and hear things that have been things that I understood conceptually, and I'd say almost pre-term, especially with intersectionality. I experience it, hear it, and feel it differently now in a way that's made a lasting impact. That's something, but you have to be okay with being uncomfortable.
Did you feel like you were in La La Land with Obama? I mean, I worked on both of his campaigns, but I felt like we were a little bit La La Land. Like, isn't this wonderful?
I think, I think I'm definitely like the white liberal woman sort of complex. I went to a women's college, but I spent my adult years abroad. I came back during the Obama administration and was really shocked at how bad it was. And I think the Trump thing really just stumped me. So, but I was able, through my own privilege, in my opinion, to ignore it and live as I normally would because I'm part of the dominant culture. So that was interesting when you said about dominant culture. I've noticed it in whiteness. I notice it everywhere.
That mic can go all the way up. It won't. I mean, it's.
All right, it looks like we have a portable
it doesn't
mic.
connect, but it's long enough that you can walk and they can come up to you.
Okay. So that comment was that it's about being okay with being uncomfortable and allowing that to be a place for learning. Okay. So I learned that this is a super long cord. So what about for others? What does inclusive feminism look like to you?
In '68, I was 21 years old. From that perspective, a lot of the focus was not on us in the group, but on who was the enemy. You know, who was keeping us down? What was keeping us down? And it wasn't so much that. And I've been surprised not to hear very much about that tonight, because that's in part how you get a group of people to come together, is to recognize what is outside of them that has to be dealt with. And boy, that's what I've held with me for many years. And boy, that's the lens I see out there, and I see a lot.
So building solidarity around a common enemy.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. What about others? What is inclusive
What
feminism?
if the common enemy is you?
There is that, but that's an enemy of effectiveness as opposed to an enemy that is doing you wrong and you can join together. I'm just saying that from 1968, that was the focus of things in those days. And if that gets lost, then you still have a lot to do, but you've lost that as one of the things that help compel you forward.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
I feel with the current administration, to me, part of a big piece of this is how we don't even know our neighbors. I mean, do you talk to your neighbors? I live on Capitol Hill. I call it the neighborhood. I love my neighborhood, but it's very transient, and people live in big boxes, and so you don't really get to talk to them. But because I'm the chair for the legislative district, I'm an events and fundraiser for them, and I am also a PCO, so I go around and talk to people. And when you talk to people, talk to your neighbor, talk to somebody, communicate to the people around you, that community really does get enhanced. Does everyone know their neighbor? Okay, if you talk to your neighbor, raise your hand. If you live in a residential area that just has houses, raise your hand. A lot easier if you're going out there to your car. So I feel like how this administration came into place was we weren't really talking to each other. Now when I walk around Capitol Hill, I say hello to people, it scares the hell out of them. You know, they're on their phone, I say, hi. But if we started talking to each other like we're doing tonight, it would be helpful.
I agree, because that's part of what I think the whole is problem. And I've had a couple ciders, so that might be a little hard to understand. No. No, I have actually 3 daughters. I have no sons. I had 4 brothers, and I thought I would be the best boy mom in the world, and I got 3 daughters. And they are the most beautiful feminists I've ever seen. And before I told my daughter when I was coming tonight, she said, "Mom, you need to study and research so that you feel and you know what you're talking about when you go there." And she said, "And don't forget," because she's a senior in high school, and she said, "Don't forget that there's a generation coming up that doesn't understand the same way that many who will be there." And what that has brought to me in thinking and hearing tonight is we all come from such different places. And that's why it's so hard to understand each other. It's so hard to sometimes communicate, is because we all have something that, there's a reason why it matters to us. There's a reason why we feel the way we feel. And I come from a Mormon family. I'm very, very Mormon. I was raised to be a mother, and that was just about my only job. And I didn't feel bad about it at the time. I didn't know that maybe I should have thought I needed more. I didn't know that was maybe something that was suppression. I didn't know it that way. I now look back at it, and I don't think my mom's suppressed. But that's all she's ever done, and that's all she ever is. And that's why it's really hard to look at other people and think, why don't they see it? Why don't they understand it? Why don't they feel it? They don't know it. And so, speaking of my daughter, in her generation, she said, remember, we think and see and feel things differently because we have had different. And so that's just, I just wish we could somehow listen, because that's what you were saying, was when we're communication, listening, that's the only way it's going to happen.
Yeah. So, oh.
You haven't had the 3 ciders, have you?
And I'm of Scottish descent, so 3 ciders is nothing.
Oh. That's just breakfast.
Right. So, the way that I translated what the 68 was, it felt very two-dimensional. There was a clear us, there was a clear them, there was no middle ground. And in some ways, the simplicity of that, it is easier to fight because it's easier when you only have two choices to say, I am either the good person or the bad person, and that's it. It's simple. You can have 15-siders and still figure it out. But where we are right now, and bringing it back to the concept of intersectionality, intersectionality to me means that I can be the good person and the bad person at the exact same time using the exact same words. And that is a whole lot more complicated to stay in the fight. So I think that there are a lot of people who, as soon as Trump was elected, they had a lot of vim and vigor because they were part of the good guys. And then they got into it a little bit further and started trying to work on things and maybe being in very large Facebook groups and had to be a bad guy too. And I think a lot of folks aren't able to do that. And so I think intersectionality is we are now three-dimensional. This is geometry, and it used to just be simple addition and subtraction.
This doesn't reach. It doesn't reach.
But we're only as intersectional as we wish to be. Yes. Is this room intersectional? Thank you.
So this cord actually only reaches to the middle of the room. So I'm gonna put this up here and invite you all to find your way to the microphone because the microphone cannot come to you.
Can I just ask you, I really appreciated what you said earlier about not identifying with feminism in the word, because I actually think that I don't either. So there needs to be something else. So I don't either, and I think that there needs to be something else that is inclusive, because as people of color, feminism means something, and it means something incredibly important. But if you don't feel like you're part of it, Women's March, I'm going in the march and I'm watching white women take pictures with the police officers. And I was like, then I don't want to be here. I don't want to be here if that's the way that we're going to interact as we come together. So I think there has to be something that's actually different that includes everybody. And I don't know if it's the word, I don't know what it is, but it's just not feminist.
I think it's how white women look upon it.
Yeah.
Because we had somebody that was we trained peacekeepers for the march. We had about close to 100 people who we trained as peacekeepers. And one of the peacekeepers who had been at some other march said, if you're having any kinds of problems, you should just go and tap a police officer. And I was like, what? There is no way on this earth, I don't care how old I get, I don't care what changes about society, I'm going to go and tap a police officer on the shoulder. But she felt like that was perfectly right. Was she speaking from privilege? Was she speaking from experience? Where was she speaking from? Because it wasn't to me.
What? Sorry, my brain, I feel like there's some kind of early onset something happening. But anyway, it was either Alice Walker or Toni Morrison, and I feel like it was Toni Morrison that came up with the idea of womanist as her replacement for the term feminist. And I think that it's important to think, the fact that people feel excluded from the term feminist makes it important enough for us to try and think of a different term. But I also want us to do the work of thinking about what it is that makes it feel so exclusionary. Because I feel like one of the frustrations that I have with the way that feminism gets discussed, the way that feminist history gets told, is that it does have the erasure of the participation of women of color. Even, the debate that was happening this year about whether or not to wear pussy hats to the march. The fact that a woman of color actually created the pattern was completely eliminated from that dialogue. And I felt, and I just can't even imagine what it felt like for her to be like, oh, I just created this thing that I thought was for me, but I guess it wasn't because everybody's telling me it's not for me, I feel there's something bigger going on that has to do with the erasure, and that erasure. At this point, feels like it's almost in effort to say, okay, look at how sophisticated my understanding of feminism is, because I can look at a pussy hat and recognize that that represents white women, when in fact maybe it doesn't. You know, I mean, it actually ends up reproducing that exclusion rather than addressing it or working to eliminate it. And so there's something really complicated there that we need to get together to talk about and figure out what to do, because I feel like, you know, the term womanist, I mean, it kind of has some of the same issues that humanist does, you know, right? Humanist kind of erases the political importance of recognizing that there is a material reality that people who identify as femme, as women, experience. And the term womanist then kind of ups the ante on that whole notion of femininity almost a little bit, while trying to embrace a more racially inclusive term. So I don't know. I mean, I think the problem isn't necessarily with our words, but with our thoughts. And our actions, for sure.
Charmaine, what is your critique of the pussy hats? What is your critique of the pussy hats?
I don't own a pussy hat. I didn't want a pussy hat because I just don't wear pink ears on my head. It had nothing to do with whether someone's vagina was pink or not. None of those things. I just don't wear them. When we talked about it in our group, it was like it was sort of a surprise to us that people were on our Facebook page asking us, well, where can we get more pink yarn? We don't know. And it was sort of surprised, like out of all the things we were working on, that's what people were really focusing on. It became such a wild, like, we've got to have those pussy hats. People were sending people pussy hats across the country. Women in Korea were making pussy hats. It was like, we were like, what? All of a sudden, that became what it was about. And I felt like people grasped that because they couldn't grasp the reality. This was not a parade, okay? Not a parade. I mean, I had people tell me, I'm going to go march in Washington because I don't know if Seattle will really do much. Ha. Who was there? Raise your hand. Okay, who went to Washington? D.C. Wait, there's a whole bunch of people here who didn't even raise their hand. You didn't do anything? San Francisco. But that whole idea that people, like in this last year, we didn't organize the one for this past year because we thought, okay, enough with the marching. Do something. It's not a parade. Do something. Talk to your neighbor. Get people to vote. Go out and vote. Do something. But I'm mad. If you're mad enough to go do something. So the pussy hats seemed like it was just sort of a distraction. And people really do. Now, occasionally you'll see people like us on the light rail, and this mom, it was a mom, I'm assuming it was her daughter with her. She had on the pussy hat, and the little girl had on the pussy hat. And she was talking to the little girl, and the little girl kept staring at me, and I felt like saying, take that pussy hat off. But I didn't. I just smiled at her. Isn't that cute? But it was like, I don't know. I think the mom was almost wearing it like it was sort of a badge, like a badge of honor, like, I marched. I was there.
See, I am totally, like, opposite of you. I mean, if you have a hat, like, you should wear it, because otherwise that's just wasteful. I mean, like, that yarn came from somewhere, and that labor came from somewhere, and that should be respected. But two, like, you know, I mean, the whole thing that the pussy hats represented, which is that, you know, as my friend Cynthia says, we have a predator in chief right now, right? I mean, that's not something that was only an issue for that one day, you know? And if I wear that pink pussy hat and that makes people think about the fact that he said that he likes to grab women by the pussy and feels like he can do that with impunity, well, then, you know what? I will wear that damn pussy hat. I mean, granted, I haven't worn it for a while, but, like, now I want to.
The next talk you'll be wearing the
yeah, totally. I mean, the next time that matches my outfit, I am wearing it.
So what does feminist success look like? Like, how do we know when the goals of feminism are met, have been met?
I feel like that's why God invented feminist utopian novels, right? Because I don't think we know the answer to it. I mean, it's this ongoing thought experiment. And I also feel like it's an ongoing moving target, right? I mean, we're never going to be done. We're always going to find, as human beings, new ways to be oppressive and awful or something, you know? And so it's just going to be this kind of moving target, this ever-evolving thing. Because feminism, I mean, as much as it is about getting us to rethink gender roles and, you know, equal pay for women and all that kind of stuff, it's also about trying to create a world that we actually want to live in. And that work is never going to be done.
Hi. So I'd like to think that we've...
You can hold on to that.
Oh, I don't have to... I can stand tall.
Stand up, girl.
I would like to think that we're getting there when I don't have to be afraid to talk to a stranger if he's a man because he thinks I'm flirting with him. When I don't have to be afraid to walk outside at night. When I don't have to be afraid to ask for a raise or let my boss know I'm pregnant. I have lived my life in fear for 56 years, and I'm done. I am so done. I traveled around the world for 2 years by myself. Everybody told me not to do it because I was a woman. They wouldn't have told my son that if he was half my age, but I wasn't supposed to do it because I was a woman. I'm tired. I'm tired of it. And I want to think that my nieces and the granddaughters can walk without fear, that aren't going to get wolf whistled, that can wear a short dress without being told, what were you wearing when he attacked you? That to me is what it's going to look like.
There's someone right behind you there.
I think what you said is absolutely important and true, but I also think we have to take account of where we've been and what's different that we created. This state had almost 50% of its legislators as women because women organized and we got them elected. And that's one of the things I see as a parallel now. All these women who are stepping up and saying, yeah, I'm going to get in there and be one of the power makers. And I'm going to change laws. And we did change laws. And one of them was your right to sign a contract even if you were married. That's one I personally worked on, not as a legislator, but as a citizen lobbyist, because we organized. There's a long list of those things that we did. And one of the organizations that did it was Washington Women United. We organized, we raised money, we hired a lobbyist, and we fought for legislation. And one of the things that bothers me now, that scares me, is that that legislation's being taken apart, piece by piece. So the people in this room have to make sure it's not taken apart.
Why do you think, I just want to ask you, why do you think women are better at organizing?
I don't know that we are, but I know that we damn well did it.
And I think that's the key. I feel like if you could really, we talk about the sisterhood, and we sometimes just think that applies to just black women or any women of color, but I feel like if we start recognizing the power of sisterhood, the sheer power of sisterhood, it changes everything. It's a game changer. For one day, you were able to do that. So that day has to matter in every day. I mean, to me, it's standing up for the people in your neighborhood, standing up for the people at your job, standing up for Amy. But not that sisterhood that says men are evil, because I don't believe that's true, and I'm a lesbian, and you might think that I might think that. But no, I think they're quite useful. They are. When you talk about access, they're white men at the center. You need to have at least one white man that's your friend, because he's the center, and then the access breaks out from there. I was riding on the train. I have dual citizenship, So I was going up to Canada to visit my family at a holiday, and I sat next to a man, a white man, who was a Trump supporter. Now, I was on Hillary leadership team. I just was like, oh my God, really? He was from Pennsylvania, in someplace very, very Trump oriented. But he didn't say it proudly. He said his wife and his 3 daughters were sitting in front of us. They were all Hillary supporters. So I thought, oh my gosh. But he kept saying at least 4 times during our conversation, this is 4 hours on a train, he said, well, I'm just quiet. The girls just make all the decisions. And he kept saying that, and I thought he voted for him not because he believed anything. It's because he thought he was going against these women, his own family who had organized against him. And I thought, wow. So I just waited, and I said, he says, oh, well, what's done is done. Really? I said, wow. I said, did you know that it was 2 days after Christmas, and I had not received my Social Security check. Now, I'm in a position where that's not the worst thing, but I said, have you thought about all those people who didn't get it because he got rid of all these people in the Social Security department? Because there's nobody working there? And he just was like dumbfounded, like, what? I said, yeah, he was a dentist. He had his own practice. He was able to take his entire family up to Canada to go skiing. Good on you. But it was so interesting to be talking to him because I have another friend that's a Trump supporter, but then he decided he'd better vote for Hillary because we were all going to kill him. He wasn't a Trump supporter, he's actually a Republican, and I don't know that many Republicans. So anyway, but at the end of the train trip, and we didn't even argue. It was just the two of us just talking, and me telling my story, and him telling his story. And I realized his story was about he was doing it because of his power position. It had nothing to do with the politics of Trump. It was his power position in his family. But at the end of our dialogue, because I really walked away like, wow, that was very interesting. I wasn't mad. I didn't yell at him. I just kept bringing him facts about my life. And he said at the end, he goes, well, I guess I better do something to get everybody through these years. I said, I guess you better. That's great. And he said, can I give you a hug? Sure. I'll give you a hug. And I hugged his wife. I said, I'm so sorry. And she even said, because he's a dentist, dentists have to talk to everybody. He still has to make money, so he's working on everybody's mouth. But she said, don't even bring it up. Like, we are so through with him. So it brings me just to that point of bringing your authentic self, and there's just talking your truth. If you tell your truth, we always say that, if you tell your truth.
Hi, thank you, both of you, and thank you for putting this on. The question was, what is the success of feminism? And I'm a millennial, so I wasn't around in '68, but one word that I haven't heard in this group is patriarchy. And one thing that's been interesting in me in my life is when I was growing up, feminism was founded in individualism and this idea of individual empowerment. So commercialism, so like if you buy this product, then you are an independent woman, or if you work really hard in a man's world and you follow his rules, then you can do it and you beat the system. But what I've learned is it's not about your individual ability to, buck the trend. It's about there's a system holding us down. So when you ask what's success in feminism, it's actually not having oppression steeped in either sex or gender, because those are two very different things. And so if we can have a society where we can not have a system oppressing someone because of sex or gender, then that's what I would see success as. Thank you. And then to your just last point, the first question was, how do you have an intersectional feminist movement? I think a lot of people here have talked about and acknowledged their privilege, but we haven't talked about leveraging your privilege. And I think if you really, and I wanted to ask you guys, like, if you wanted to have an intersectional movement, you do need men in that movement. You do need white women in that movement. But those people because they have more privilege, it's not enough to acknowledge it. It's important to say, and I have access to spaces, and I need to make sure other voices go into those spaces. And then I also, sorry, I've been thinking about this for a while. I think it's also important to make sure that when you are building that movement, not to have unintended consequences. So you talked a little bit about the cops for the Women's March. And a very recent example is the Parkland shooting, where a lot of people said we need more cops in schools. And a lot of the black students or students of color said, they're gonna shoot us. Like, that's just what happens. And so anyone, I just wanted to hear your thoughts on the intersectionality of leveraging privilege in a useful way, and then making sure that when you are building a feminist inclusive movement, that you're making sure you're not having unintended consequences out of that.
Well, and that reminds me, so when you were saying at the beginning that, you know, your idea of what a feminist success would look like would be the eradication of patriarchy. I mean, I feel like it goes to what bell hooks, and I always get this wrong, but basically like a global capitalist, heterosexist patriarchy, and there's a couple more words in there, right? Like, you can't just end one because they're all intertwined, right? Like, each one kind of co-creates the other. And so, you know, I mean, a feminist success isn't just the elimination of patriarchy, because patriarchy can't be eliminated without addressing racism and heterosexism and capitalism and all of the things that generate systemic inequality in our society. I'm trying to come up with a smart answer to your actual question about leveraging my privilege, and that's a tough one, and I don't have a real good answer to that. Because, no, please, I would love to be rescued.
So, what ideas do you all have about how to leverage privilege to work towards social change?
Do you need a microphone for that question? She's asking, how do you have suggestions on how to leverage privilege to create and institute change?
No, I think someone's coming next.
No.
Oh, you're not doing that. Okay.
So the way that I leverage my privilege. Y'all can hear me now. The way that I leverage my privilege is almost in every moment. In every moment, you know, when I walk into a room, I do a head count. How many people of color are there in this room? And at what point can I acknowledge that to the leadership that's a gap in the experience of being in this room? And when my coworkers would say, "Hey, let's go do this thing," or some whatever it was that would come up. It doesn't need to be a battle in every moment and every day, but it should be some part of how you engage with the world in all aspects of how you engage in the world if you have privilege.
Every time somebody talks about being in the room, I just want to sing Hamilton. Anybody else having that? I would sing it for you guys. Thank you. I want to be in the room where it happens, the room where it happens, the room where it
I
happens.
think also that and I'm just going to speak to what we all know, and that's our community of Seattle. Okay? There's really not that many activists, people of color. So constantly we are asking ourselves, and I do at least 3 different volunteer stuff that I do. Everybody always goes, "Oh, we got to get more women of color on our board. We got to get more." It's really? Do you know how many of this there are, really? There's not that many. So y'all need to kind of leverage something and be brave enough to go forward. Because you know what? We are tired. Because we are constantly having to teach. And it's not up to us to have to do that. So when you think about how can I leverage my privilege, why don't you leverage your privilege to help all these groups that need that help? Everybody flocked to Planned Parenthood. Oh boy, did they get a lot of people. They got so many, they were turning around asking us, what do we do with them? So think about just in your community, the food bank down the street. We haven't talked about seniors. What's going on with them? Like, if you really want to leverage privilege, quit asking for every person of color to have to deal with it with you. Because we are tired. We will, of course, continue to do it because we can't exist without having to do that. When we walk into a room, I traveled in Vietnam, which was really fabulous, and it was so nice to be around a lot of brown people. It's like, yeah, there's a lot of brown people here. I didn't have to keep stopping and trying to figure something out. But we live in Seattle. There's not a lot of us here doing work. I have the privilege to be able to do the work. There's lots of people that have to get up, go to work, take care of their kids, and see if they can manage not to live in a car tomorrow. That's where leverage is. Have the courage to do that. Okay, I'm sorry to yell at you.
So we have time for one more here.
Thank you for that. And I would say the thing that probably resonated the most, much of what you said has resonated with me. I think the thing that has resonated the most is you can't really say, like, what are the goals of you have to know what are the goals of feminism. We have to have a common understanding of that before we can say when it's successful. So that's what we should be talking about, I think.
And that's definitely a long-term project.
So to close, I'd like to ask Amy and Charmaine, you've talked about this a bit already, but do you have some very specific actionable steps that folks can take as they leave here to be involved in the work of feminism and social justice more broadly?
So my ideas all really revolve around discussions, right? I'm very much about using every opportunity that presents itself to have dialogue across difference around uncomfortable topics. And for me, I always use popular culture as the jumping off point, right? Because it's a lot easier to talk about something out there rather than here. I mean, it'll frequently make that movement, but at least it gives you something that's shared that you can hang these ideas on. And so a lot of what I do is getting people to think critically about the media that they consume, the popular culture, entertainment that they consume, and figuring out how to think critically about the ideas that are being presented, what they think needs to change in terms of representation, as well as the ideas that are even being engaged. I think that the new TV, the return of Roseanne to TV is a really interesting opportunity for dialogue, and I've been reading a lot of articles about it. I haven't actually watched it yet, but so many people are like, oh God, this show was so important in terms of representation of class in the 90s. And now you have Roseanne as this very vociferous Trump supporter, and she's written that into this TV show. But on the other hand, everybody who's seen it is like, I want to hate it, and it's actually really good and really thought-provoking, and it's doing a really excellent job of engaging these issues that as a society we clearly need to wrestle with right now. And it's wrestling with it in terms of gender fluidity, multiracial, and, class, and aging, because now that Roseanne and Dan are getting older, they're talking a lot about access to healthcare and things like that that are all part of the things that we can talk about. And I think that it creates a really unique opportunity for us to talk across those differences. And that's just kind of one of those examples. I think that the new Black Panther movie is a really interesting opportunity to have a major superhero blockbuster take up issues of what solidarity looks like, how white people can support a black movement. All kinds of things are happening in that movie, and it's all very interesting to think about what was it that made that particular iteration of an primarily black cast, black produced film something that white America has embraced in a way that is not what like Bill Cosby was doing with The Cosby Show, which was basically doing a white middle class sitcom with people of color in it. So that's my thing. I'm also really into using social media and your wallet to force Hollywood to do better, you know? So like if a movie that you think is doing something important, like A Wrinkle in Time that just came out, go on opening weekend to kind of bump up the sales figures so that Hollywood will be like, okay, this was a moneymaker and we need to support more projects like this or projects that are done by these particular creators and by these actors and actresses. So anyway, that's my thing. Your turn.
I never watched Roseanne, so I haven't seen the new one either, so I was like, nah. But I'm really much more ethnocentric. I really feel that I really want people to look around them in their neighborhoods. You know, get to know your neighbor, ask what you can do, and if you take your privilege to a nonprofit, don't walk in as though you've just saved them. You have not. You're no use to them unless you're actually bringing something like, can I answer phones for an hour? Can I do, you know, that you can do something for them. Ask what, you know, they say, don't ask what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Instead, don't ask about that, about Seattle. Go and do something. And actually have a conversation with someone. I think that Facebook is great to tell me that somebody just had a baby. I don't think it's a great place to have a discussion. And I know that that sounds like a 65-year-old, but I think that that's a coward's way of trying to do something. I don't think that movements are created on Facebook. That's just blather. I think that it happens, and human revolution happens person to person. So that's what I want to encourage people to do, and get out there and vote. Yes. Don't vote, though, because, oh, it's a woman of color. She's got to be good. No, maybe she doesn't know what she's even doing. Like, really have a conscience about this. Actually do some research. Find out, is there something that they've done? Why would you want someone to do something they had no experience in? And I love Emerge. I love Emerge. I think it's the best thing ever.
What's Emerge?
Oh, Emerge is as an organization. It's national, but there's Emerge Washington, organization that's encouraging women to go out and run for office. But they also have a boot camp so they can train people. And some of my friends are on their board. And I said, you know what? Please don't tell women that you should go run for an office. They have no idea what they're doing just because they're mad that the trash doesn't get picked up on their street. That's not a reason to run. And especially don't think that you can run without money. Sorry, you do need money. I know it's bad, but you need money. So to me, take that and go do something. Feel like when the next time something comes up, you can say, yes, I did something about that. Not that I just kind of talked about it, or I'm not that kind of person. I'm not a person that goes, no, you need to be that person. This world's going fast. So he's not going anywhere, people. He's not going anywhere. So you have to start working towards keeping these organizations that are doing the real, true grassroots work, make sure that they can still do their job. And a friend of mine, one of the women's on our board, she, Palmira, she has been working with all these women. They actually this is the world we're in. They had to come together to make a plan in case one of their friends got taken. What's going to happen to their friends' children? Instead of marching down the street being all mad about guns, why don't you go to the school in your neighborhood? Talk about that. Go help those PTAs. Help get more teachers. Those are, to me, the things that are solid. So I'm just suggesting be a badass and go do solid things.
Thank you, Charmaine, and thank you, Amy, and thanks to all of you for being here tonight, and thanks to Humanities Washington and to Naked City Brewery. Have a great evening.
And thank you to Teresa for moderating.
Thank you, Teresa.